Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to our first Process Mining Café after the summer break. I'm here with Rudi. Hi, Rudi.
Hi.
And we're talking about project planning today. It's part of our project guide series. It's a very important element. So the project guide series is the process mining methodology, if you will, and describes the steps that you need to carry out to perform a successful process mining project. So we have identified 12 steps that you go through basically in every process mining project. And of course, process mining itself is agnostic with the type of methodology that you use around it, right? But you need to be aware of which methodology is used in your organization, and process mining need to be fitted into that. We will come back to that later in the session. But we already wanted to ask you, for those of you who are watching live right now, to let us know in the chat what the methodologies are that you are using in your organization. For example, are you using Lean for your improvement projects, or for example, Agile in the software development? So depending on the process that you are analyzing. We would really like to know. So it's very easy to join the chat. Just below the video where you're watching this right now, you can enter your name. You don't need a password or anything. Just press the button and you're in there, and you can let us know there in the chat. All right, so we're coming back to the project guide, and there are several steps, right, Rudi, that we are going through in the process mining project. And today we wanted to repeat a little bit the first step, the process selection, and talk mostly about the project plan, which is the second one. So I'm not sure if you can see my screen, but I'm bringing this up.
Here it is.
Now, here it is, yes. So, right, we wanted to start at the very beginning. So let's talk a little bit about the process selection. Why do you think it's important that people think about selecting the right process for the process mining project?
Yeah. So if we look at executing a process mining initiative, then sometimes it's already very clear, right? What you want to do. You have a clear objective, or maybe a clear process where you want to get started. But in some cases, it's not that obvious which process you can best pick in order to get started with process mining. And it could be your first project, but it could also be the second or the third. So the project selection is kind of a way where you can segment or compare different type of potential process mining candidate initiatives and see if they are more likely to be a good candidate to get started with process mining. I think it's a first important step, because if you select the wrong process, then from the start you will encounter all these type of challenges, right? So it's best to look into something that's where you can have more success.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, that's always a little bit challenging, especially if it's your first process mining project. It's really hard to know which process you should choose, right? So to give a little bit of guidance, we have this quadrant, and we also have a blog post about it that we will link in the show notes for the session today. But we want to briefly go through it, because you can basically look at these four kind of dimensions or combinations of two dimensions. The two dimensions are the data availability, which is clear, right? To do process mining, you need data. So is the data available, but also the process awareness in terms of how good the process is defined and how much people are following it. So we start in the lower left corner, right, Rudi? So this is, how would you describe this combination?
Yeah. So if you have kind of a process which is undefined or not developed yet, right? So you still figure out an ad hoc way in order to execute a particular request or a particular product which you want to produce. But no process is defined, and it's not supported by any means of a system, right? So all the interactions take place are ad hoc. Could be by phone or by email, without any very structured process or system. Yeah.
It could even be, I think, doesn't have to be completely ad hoc. It could even be something like once a year you're doing a strategy planning to determine the strategy of the company for the next year. You're having a series of meetings. You're taking down some notes in the meeting minutes, and maybe you have some updated strategy briefs or things like that. So it's not that it's completely ad hoc. You do it every year, but still, these are processes. They often have very low volume also, right? Low volume. It's not very defined how the process goes. So it's in a nutshell, it's not very suitable as a process selected for your process mining project.
Yeah, and the other dimension, of course, is you figure it out as you go, right? So also if it's kind of a yearly strategy plan, then it could be a standardized process where you have a clear work instruction for yourself how you would do this because you have done this in the past. But in this particular quadrant, you figure it out again. So it could be that you have some knowledge, right, how you did this in the past and start reapplying it, but it's not that you have developed a standard process for it.
Right.
And that's the big difference if you go to the next quadrant.
Yeah, and that's why the focus is on defining, right? That's why it says, like, if you're in this quadrant and you want to do more with it, the focus is on defining the process first. And you might go then up to the top left quadrant, where you have this definition, right? You have an understanding of the process, but you don't have data. So it could be a completely manual process, for example, in a municipality, a building permit project, but the municipality has not adopted any IT system yet. It's all being done in paper, right? That could be an example.
Yeah, and it's kind of a scale, right? So it could be that you have a very clear work instruction and people have adopted this work instruction, so kind of follow a clear path of how to execute the whole process. But it could also be something in the middle. So we have agreed upon, but more on an abstract level, how the coarse grained steps of the process go. And that's kind of the spectrum. So the main gain here is to start automate or implement something to support the whole process and to be able to collect some data as part of the process.
Right. And from a process mining perspective, it's not that you cannot do anything. So if this is an important project, it is possible to collect data manually for a limited amount of time, right? So you could, for example, let people write down the main activities they do for 2 weeks or something and analyze it. There are some examples where people have done this, and then you could do a process mining analysis based on this manual sample. But also in the process so here the focus is then usually on digitizing those processes for the future. Once you introduce a system, an IT system that supports this process, you can make sure that the data that's being recorded is suitable for future process mining initiatives. So you have all the right data that you need. And the third quadrant, let's look at that. That's the opposite, basically, right?
Yeah, so on the left side, of course, it's about data, right? So if you look at process mining, so of course the data analysis technique that's being used for processes. So if there's limited support of any system by means of collecting this data, it's less likely that it's easy to apply process mining, right? So it doesn't mean that you can't, but it's less likely. And on the right side, there are kind of two options. On the bottom right, we have discover. So that means low process awareness, but there is some kind of support of a system. So you can think about a hospital that has implemented some kind of hospital administrative system. So they are capturing for all the events that are happening or all the activities that are happening, very structured in a particular way, the data. But it could be that for certain processes, the process is not defined yet, right? Because it's complex. So if you look at treatment paths after the diagnosis, maybe it's very clear what they are going to do. Yeah. But before the treatment, it's kind of undefined. So you have all the different type of activities in different order. So the first step which you need to take before you actually can improve the process is to be able to discover the standard process. And that's what we see and define kind of as discover. So it requires an additional step to discover the process and maybe to develop a standard. So it could also be that there is no guideline yet. So before you can improve the process, you should have a fixed guideline or agreed upon a standard working process. So it requires an additional step.
Yeah, and it can be a really interesting area for process mining to look at these type of processes because the data is already there. And I think really the example you gave with the healthcare system is a really good one because first of all, people sometimes think if there's an IT system, it has to be an automated process. It's not true, right? Very, very often the IT systems, they're there to support in terms of documenting the steps that are happening, but they're completely driven by the people who work in the process. And yeah, healthcare process is a very good example because actually you don't want to restrict this flexibility in any way. You want the doctors to be able to go every direction in the process and to do what's necessary, and the data is collected along the way. But despite this flexibility, it can be very interesting to discover the process and then maybe to find ways to standardize certain parts of it. Like you said, certain areas maybe are more suitable for standardization, and others you're not going to do that. And so that's the first step. But it can be a little bit challenging, right? Often these are the more complex processes also that we see in this area.
Yeah, and you can see also the objective can also change, right? So the discovery could be an objective by itself. So understanding actually how the process works.
What are we doing? Oh, exactly. And then, so then you have the last one, right?
So that's the more typical, right? So if we are looking at process improvement or optimization, or even compliance, right? So it's called optimize, but that means at least you have kind of an expectation of the process, and for compliance it's kind of the same thing, right? And then we can have the process mining analysis of this, or the discovered process. And then you can find discrepancies between what you expect to see and what you actually see. And this difference, of course, or this gap, brings out kind of the improvement potential of the process itself. And in the guide or the project selection guide, of course, if you are looking at your very first process mining initiative, and then we recommend kind of to pick something at the top right corner, because if you want to make impact, it's easier to make impact there already in the discussion, because you don't have to have the discussion about the standard or standardize the process, which can take quite some time in the discussion. You should take the time if you create such a standard. But in the optimization stage, you can show, I see a deviation here in the process. Should this happen or not? And then you have a concrete discussion and you can directly add value there.
Yeah, exactly. So the focus there is often on optimization, and this is of course an iterative process, as many of you know, right? It's not one improvement project and then you're done, but after that you're going through the next improvement cycle. So you're improving the process further. And maybe one note on the label automated process. So there's also various degrees of automation that you see even in this kind of quadrant, right? So for example, if you think of an ERP system, then there maybe some of the routing logic is automated. So after a certain step is finished, it goes to the next person, or something maybe is also forbidden or required through certain process rules. But in general, it's the people who perform the steps and who are driving the process. It's still, the process itself is still driven by manual steps. And this is, of course, what's most interesting to look at in an improvement project. If you're looking at a straight through processing process, then maybe large parts of the process are automated and only certain situations, like samples that are taken or certain specific situations are being done manually. So then there's more automated parts. But if a process is fully automated, it's also not really interesting for process mining anymore, right? Really, would you agree?
Yeah, so it depends. So also in an automated way, you could have batches and then understand that something is waiting for a batch to run at night, for example. And that can cause a delay, that can have customer impact. But if something's completely automated and things taking milliseconds, right, and then you can argue how relevant it is from a timing perspective, at least, or an SLA perspective. But I think, most of the processes are human-driven, right? And these human interactions take coordination, also coordination with the customer. And with customer journeys is kind of the same thing, to do the right things at the right time. So it's not... And I think it's a human thing, so it requires certain knowledge or insights to do things and to make things simple, right? So if we complicate matters, then it becomes really fuzzy when to do a certain thing or to be compliant, and then you make mistakes. Well, if it's more standardized or if the agreements are more easy to understand, then it's of course less likely that you actually make these mistakes.
Yeah, that's true. But it's a good point. So there are completely automated processes where you still can analyze process mining. So I have to think of the Van der Lande example where Boris was talking about the kind of the baggage system problems. So maybe we can link that as a counter example. But yeah, just in general, from what I see in practice, usually it's where some humans are involved. Usually that's the sweet spot, like for selecting a process mining process.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So let's say you have...
and I think in another dimension, and that's also, if you look at the quadrants, it's not apparent, but if a process is very standard or very simple, so a couple of weeks ago I had an example where someone was looking at a production process of boots, for example, and that process contained of just 3 steps, and it was always the same, and there was no deviation. And so, you can dive into this process with process mining, but probably you would not find a lot of interesting things other than maybe temporal things, right? That the production was stopped or something like that. Yeah. So also certain complexity, I think, is also favorable for process mining.
Yeah, you need to be able to make some impact, right? And so there are some other criteria. I think that we're coming back a little bit now, also when we're talking a little bit more about the second step, right? Once you have selected your process, you're making a project plan, and we have identified 5 ingredients that you basically need to put a good project plan together, and we wanted to go through them, and some of them also ultimately maybe can reflect back a little bit which process is good to select, right? For example, having a good sponsor. So we come back to this discussion too. But before you even get to think about which people you need to involve, it's really important to think about the goals, right? So something that people sometimes forget, especially if they're very eager to start with their process mining project. They maybe have got some data already, they start analyzing it, and then they're completely in the middle of it and realize that they have kind of jumped over this step to think about what's the goal or the objective. So we recommend to really make it a point to think about that at the beginning of making a project plan. And can you describe a little bit like how you like to break that up into not just like one objective, but to think about kind of these different dimensions that you define: situation, problem, goal? How are they different?
So first of all, if you are thinking about an objective for process mining, there can be different things, right? So I would recommend to think about your objective. And is it in a sense that you want to give insight? So would the insight be enough? Or are you driving all the way through to make an improvement, right? So are you trying to make impact? And this can also be different if you compare, for example, an audit or a process improvement initiative. So an audit is most likely to result into advisory or an audit report where you find certain things, maybe risks that need to be mitigated or kind of the result of your evaluation. And so it's more or less likely to be an insight. While if you look at a process improvement initiative, they are often driven by either reducing cost or improving customer satisfaction, for example. And so then the end goal is different. And I think it's important to think about what's your goal, right? And is that the goal, what you want to achieve? And the only person who can say if that's the goal or align with that goal is the sponsor, of course. So I think there the conversation starts with the sponsor. And then, of course, you can quickly accept your problem or your objective, but you can also kind of continue to discuss it. And that's also interesting if you look at from a lean perspective. I saw that someone in the chat was also using kind of the lean methodology, which we come later on. It identifies kind of a defined stage, and in that defined stage you are kind of arguing the whole objective. And then you can break it down. So from kind of what you think you should do, you can go back to, okay, what's the situation here? What are we trying to do? What is kind of the historical background of the process? What did we try to achieve? Did we try to automate the whole process, for example? And what was the result of that transformation of the process itself? Do we still have issues? What are people saying about the process? And what's kind of the complication or the problem is something that we need to do right now, right? So in a certain sense, if you have a situation, this is a more general description, but the problem kind of is the argument why we should do something about it right now. So what is kind of the thing that the sponsor sees that's very important to change this right now? And that should be tied to the goal. And all these three things should then be kind of aligned. So give you kind of the perspective of how you want to approach your project. So break it down from the description of your situation towards the thing that should help you to change something now, and in your problem definition.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I like that you frame it from these two angles, because on the one hand side, you're looking at it from the perspective of the sponsor or the person who's, for example, responsible for the process, and looking from what they see as the problem. And then it can also be a question: is process mining? It can also be a question: if process mining is the right tool for that, right? Or if it's the right process. For example, we talked before about the 4 different quadrants, and also Eva said in the chat, like, if it's a fully automated process, the focus is maybe more on monitoring. So sometimes also people, especially if they are new to process mining, they don't really know the difference yet. So maybe there's someone who comes to you and says what they're describing to you sounds like they want to monitor their process. Maybe process mining is not the right solution for this type of problem, right? On the other hand, the dimension is what the goal is for you or for the organization. Is it learning? Is it about learning about process mining, doing a first project, or is it really about a certain purpose? So and there's not one right answer, but it depends on what you want, and it's good to be clear about it. That's the main point, to really be aware.
Yeah, and that's kind of what you see in practice, right? Especially if you're doing this for the first time, or even I think also if you are doing it for a longer time, then new objectives come in. But it's also balancing these multiple agendas, right? So if you are learning and then you get this question where you need to do something very complex, right? So if you have a very ambitious sponsor and then that sponsor is saying, we want to do an end-to-end process, a review, and you already know there are 5 systems involved, already a lot of question marks if these systems actually capture the data. So there are already from the start a lot of challenges and challenges to fill, right? And I think it's good to kind of align here so that these objectives, but also the expectations are aligned, and that you can give some pushback, but also that you can make it more iterative. And I think process mining is very suitable to do this kind of agile approach where you iterate through, still providing results each time, and then work towards the bigger goal. So you can make the goal smaller and do first one system, for example, or one part of the process, and then iterate through to go to the next, but still align with the sponsor what he will get and what he can expect.
Yeah, exactly. But if needed, also iterate a little bit even on the problem statement, right? So not just take the first problem statement that you get from the sponsor, for example, and write that down, but ask what's behind it. There could be other problems behind it, but also like similar to if maybe the goal is to monitor a process and instead of analyzing it, sometimes if you ask people like what they want to know or what the questions are that they have about the process, they give kind of more standard like KPIs that you could also measure in a different way because they don't understand yet the type of analysis that could be done with process mining, right? So it's good to dig a little bit deeper and to really come up with a good definition of what the situation is, but also the problem and the goal, and to be really clear.
Yeah, and in your objective as well. So because I think you can balance the objective And so the objective could be that from the start you're trying to realize benefits. And sometimes the harsh benefits are we do a cost saving, for example, or we improve the process this percentage in lead time. So that's a very hard promise. Yeah. But if you're still learning, can you make then that promise, right? So is it a realistic goal? Or can you break it up and you can still say, okay, eventually that should be the goal for this process, but let's first do an iteration where we give ourselves some time to learn and to give kind of a process map, to give insights of how the process actually works. Maybe find 2 or 3 new things about the process which we didn't know, or which the experts of the process didn't know that happened. And then you can make the whole objective smaller, and maybe it takes less time in order to get there. And then from that point you can look further ahead to see, okay, what next challenge I can take on as a process miner to do. And I think that's also important, to not overpromise certain things and be able to learn along the way. And this also helps, and that's something we're going to discuss later on as well, to reduce some of the risks that part of the project itself, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that was like the first ingredient. So really be really clear about the objective, the goal that you have with the project. And then let's come to the second ingredient, and that brings us back to what we mentioned at the beginning already of the Café, is that you're performing a process mining project not in isolation or it always has a context, right? So that's why we were asking you what methodologies you're using. And if I look at the chat right now, I see confirmed also the examples that we gave. So people, Monica, for example, says they're using Lean as well as Agile. So that's, I think these are typical examples, but we see different ones that people use in the organization. The point is that this is a method that's already in the organization, right? So there's a standardized approach, and it's good to be aware that process mining does not change that. It's not that you want to change the way the organization works, but you have to figure out how process mining and the different steps in your process mining project connect to this kind of overarching methodology around it. So we picked 3 examples, right? Really just to show you like how this can look like. So for example, so DMAIC, right? That's define, measure, analyze, improve, control. That's a very common Lean methodology, right?
So you can, I think, go to the right slide.
Let me go back. Yeah. Can you see it now?
Yeah, now we can see it. Yeah, so the DMAIC stands for Define, Measure, Analyze, Improve, and Control. And if you look at this methodology, the methodology is around improving, right? So these different methodologies have also different objectives, and that makes them different in a sense, how they are broken down in the different phases. And as you can see here underneath, you still have the 12 steps. So the 12 steps they don't change. So the process mining approach in these 12 steps are kind of now mapped to each of the phases, part of the DMAIC of Six Sigma. And if you look at this approach, in the define, you are kind of selecting the right process. You make the project plan. You do what they call in Lean Six Sigma the critical to qualities. So that these are the analysis questions, and that is kind of aligned. So if you have these analysis questions, then you can go to the next phase, and it's the measure to set kind of the baseline. So then you need to extract your data and need to transform your data to be able to see and answer the coarse grain question. For example, what's the lead time of the whole process?
And maybe so it's always good to see concrete examples. Also, how does this look like, right, Rudi? So maybe we can also link in the show notes the Lean Six Sigma series, where people see like how do you actually use process mining in a Lean Six Sigma project, and what is different compared to kind of the traditional way of doing it, and what does it add, what does change. And the same also, if we look at another example, so this is the DMake framework. If we're looking at the auditing framework, so there is also, of course, a formalized and a standardized way how an audit is performed in an organization, for example, in an internal audit department. And that's kind of these 4 phases were given in one of the process mining camp presentations. We can point to that too. But the same 12 steps, like Rudi just said, they are still being performed. So an auditor has different goals and different questions that they want to answer, but they're still following the same 12 steps to perform their process mining project. And also here, it's nice to see a concrete example. And we have a very nice auditing case study that we will link to, where the city of Vienna showed exactly, like, step by step how they went through their audit project and exactly the steps that they carried out on the way. And just to show another example, because it can be any kind of methodology where you can put that on. So this is the Plan, Do, Check, Act improvement cycle, where you again find these 12 steps, right? And really, our message here again is not that there's a right or wrong methodology, but it's really important what's the methodology that you use in your organization, and that you find the connection points to that and make sure your process mining project fits into this way of working.
Yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is the second ingredient, right, that we need for the project plan, knowing what the methodology is that is used in your organization. And the third one is about the sponsorship and the project team. So we have discussed this sometimes already in the past, but there's different roles and skills that you need to perform a successful process mining project. And on the picture that you see here on the slide, the green ones are the ones that are very close to what you do actually with the process mining tool, right? So you have the data analyst, which is here the process mining analyst who's using the process mining tool, adding filters, importing the data, and so on and so forth. But there might be some, depending on the data that you have, some additional steps that need to be done to prepare the data, right? So, for example, in the data preparation café, we showed some examples for that. And you also need someone who helps you to get the data out of the system in the first place, and you need someone who knows about the methodology that we just mentioned, either as a process improvement expert, or if it's in an audit context, who knows about the audit methodology. So if that's not you, then you need to make sure you have the right people on board. And we see a broad spectrum for this, right? Really, sometimes one person covers a lot of these skills already themselves.
Ideally, right? Ideally, it's one individual.
That would be the ideal situation, but often you have to work together with different people.
And these are different type of skills. So often I also try to explain, or people who are in business process management for quite some time, they probably know, right, that if you look at process mining, it changes also the capability of the process analyst, right? So in traditional sense, or if you look at Lean Six Sigma, for example, if you do a process mapping, you do a value stream mapping exercise or a process modeling type of exercise. And so that means you are going to people, you elicit their knowledge, and then try to draw the process map based upon their knowledge. And this is more a high-level, top-down approach of describing the process. And if you are doing this with data, then it requires all different type of skills, right? So you start with data. So then you encounter data quality issues. You encounter issues of getting to the data, or signing off on security issues, or asking yourself the question if you are doing kind of an ethical analysis based upon the data. And that requires different type of skills. So in that sense, it also requires maybe some other skill set to join your initiative or project. And that's also part of, I think, the challenge of process mining. So how far will it go for you as an expert, right? So will you kind of learn the whole new data field in order to extract and prepare the data yourself? Or are there expert roles in the organization that can help you, support you in this?
Yeah, and to identify the gaps that you have in your own skill set, right? So to be aware, like, what are the things that maybe you need support with, either to develop yourself over time or to bring on board in your project.
Yeah, and that's also a very good question, because it can change from project to project, right? So if you are very familiar with Excel, that's what we see in practice, is kind of the de facto standard data tool in most organizations, right? So very accessible, of course. Yeah. But if your data gets too big, so if you're extracting data from a large ERP system and then you are looking at millions of rows, then it's not so easy to process this data in Excel anymore, right? So where do you see kind of the borders of these initiatives? And you can still do a lot on sample data, right? So you can still show that it's possible by taking a sample of that data, maybe 1,000 cases as an example, to show people what the capability is of process mining. But then if you want to take the next step and you want to scale up, then you need someone to be able to do this for you.
Yeah. And maybe in that direction, it's even a little bit easier to recognize, because you notice once, for example, you need different tools to prepare the data, and you don't know these tools because you're familiar with Excel, but not with these big data tools, for example. From the other direction, it's sometimes people miss it maybe even more easily, right? So for example, someone who's really a data expert, maybe a BI specialist, they are really familiar with all the data technologies, and then they're fascinated with process mining and they analyze the process, but then they maybe produce a process map, and then they're sitting in front of this process map and they ask, well, what should I do with this now? So they don't know how to go further, and maybe they don't realize that that's exactly the skill of, for example, a process improvement expert who knows how to bridge these insights with the domain knowledge to identify steps to improve.
Yeah, and often what I see in practice is they get to the point where they get the spaghetti diagram, right? So they can extract the data, they even look at the data quality or improve the quality of their data. And then kind of as a next step, they see this whole complex process map. And then they, of course, they can use some of the filters, right? So they figure this out, how they can apply these filters. But it's not about applying the filters alone, right? So it's try to recognize the characteristics of the process, right? So, for example, rework. And then if you look at the domain expert, if they will pull the sliders and then they say, oh, yeah, that's something I recognize. So this seems logical, right? So that's the first thing what they can do. And the second thing what they see is, oh, I see a lot of rework here. This should not happen, right? So it's about kind of being able to reflect upon the process based upon that standard. And it's kind of the same thing at the top right corner, right? So they have this reference map in their mind. And using that reference map, they know. And it's not only the reference map, because what I see myself often do is you also try to generalize these reference map if you've seen multiple processes before. So you find things that are in rework weird, or if you see an important activity, so an approval, for example, and you see it missing for certain cases, it's weird, right? So you start to question these standard patterns in the process, and that's also something that needs to be developed if you're not used to doing these type of.
But that's exactly the reason why some of the most interesting and most successful process mining initiatives are those that are being performed very close to or by the very people who are responsible for the process, right? And that's what you mentioned, like when you're in the upper right corner of this kind of process selection quadrant, then the process is defined. But if you're there working in the process, having that domain knowledge, these are exactly the people who will look at the process mining tool and they will see, well, that's not right. That shouldn't be the case. So if they can be empowered to do this type of analysis for themselves, they can have very quick, very effective improvement cycles.
And one of the challenges, if you don't have these questions up front, right? So you're looking at the process and you have limited knowledge and you are leaning heavily on the domain experts alone, right, without questioning their answers, then often it's also the pitfall of that they say, okay, this is just the case, right? We accept the status quo. And if you accept the status quo, then it's also difficult to change something, right? So if you don't give any pushback, then this is kind of what we already knew. you are not bringing any new information using your process mining exercise, and then it slowly goes away, right? So
that's a really good point. That's again the quality of a process improvement expert who knows how to question maybe the status quo, or to think beyond and to make newer suggestions for how it could be done better, for example.
So somehow, so it's also part of the consulting skills, I think, of that person in that particular role. But it's not just accept the answer of the domain expert. The domain experts give input, but you still question their answers. And it should be done in a good way and in a good spirit, I think, because then you find the right things where you can really discuss about, but also find new and alternative ways to do certain things. But I think that's also one of the challenges that you can encounter.
Yeah. And maybe one last note while we were talking here about the skills and roles, right? When we were preparing the session, you mentioned that the business expert is that the sponsor. I mean, that there can be actually different sponsors.
I had an example, right? So during this year's process mining camp, we also start to have kind of a template where we discussed about project planning to make it very easy. And there was someone who did a pure academic initiative. So the main sponsor was a professor. But on the other hand, the data was from a hospital. And there, of course, was also a contact person that was involved as part of this initiative. And so the argument is I can have one sponsor, right? So in this case, the professor. But if the hospital is not involved as much, then it's, of course, the whole research is also not taking place because you cannot get your hands on the right data. So also from a sponsoring perspective, it's good to see where is the biggest risk or the biggest challenge and how can you have the right people on board.
Yeah, I'm just having some problems. My laptop is running out of power. I'm sorry about that, but we can continue. We just know what the ingredients are and what we want to talk about. But the idea is that you have to then think about what the people are, right, and include that in your plan. So that's the third ingredient. Like we have kind of a template. Well, you can still see it, so it's going to be away, gone in a second. But it's not important actually. I think we showed the important slides. So but that's the key ingredient here, to think about who should be on your project team, and to put that in your project plan.
And if you look at the project team, so if we go back to that slide.
Project team, yeah. Can you see? Oh no, we have to. Wait a second to go back. But I think we still have it in our mind. So which one are you talking about? Which element?
So if you look at the project team and if you start planning for your initiative, then it's of course good to think about where are the biggest challenges taking place in my initiative, and where do I see the risk, right? So if you see the risk, that's often also on the boundaries of your own skill, right? So sometimes people would say, I'm not in contact with someone and they say, data, that's the biggest challenge, and I'm not sure if I can get it, and it would not be in the right format. And so I already kind of know that person also is kind of new to the whole data domain, or it's not a core competence in order to process data. So potentially it would be good to think about, which department could help me in order to support to get that data.
Yeah.
But the other way, if I'm talking with somebody who has this data skill, they would say, I'm not sure what the objective is. And I can do the process mining initiative, but nobody listens to me if I find something. Right?
That's
it's all the other perspective. So the challenge is more, can I get somebody on board from the domain, and how can I organize them and feed them with the information so that I can still make that change happen?
Yeah.
And I think that's that's one of the important things to think about if you start planning for such an initiative. Where do you see the gaps and the biggest risk? How can I involve the right people, try to mitigate this risk?
And that's exactly also the fourth ingredient that we see as a successful, important ingredient to make a good project plan, is to think about those risks, right? So coming from who the people are that you need to involve and to have on board, thinking about it from a risk perspective, like Rudi just said, is the important thing, because that's how you can also make the project plan practical. So the goal of a project plan, and we come back to that in a moment, is really about making it as likely as possible that you succeed with what you want to achieve, right? So thinking about what the risks are helps you then to build in mitigations in your approach so that you can catch any problems early on.
Yeah, correct. And there's also someone's mentioning in the chat. So, for example, how about a smaller organization who doesn't have defined all these different type of roles? So the roles which were on the slide are also not per se the roles or the individual roles that you need as part of a process mining initiative. Or these are not all different individuals, so it could be combined into one individual. But I think it's important to see, okay, if you look at this role or see this as a capability, which capabilities do I need as part of my team, and which capability do I have myself as a process miner, and which capabilities are more in the gray area or need to be included to strengthen the success of my process mining initiative.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely correct. Yeah. Now, thinking about the risks a little bit more, so what do we see as the most common risks that people have in a process mining project? So partly it must be about data also, right? You don't know in the beginning. You often don't know yet, like if the data is suitable, if there's going to be any data. That's one of the things.
Yeah, of course. I think one of the big things about the planning is to early upon, or as early as possible, think about what's the risk about the data. So first of all, people would say, do I have the data, right? So if you don't have it, then it's very difficult to continue with your initiative. The second question is, if I have it, is it of the right quality? So to be able to either review a sample or something like that, something small, to check whether or not it's suitable enough to perform your project. And there are different levels, right? So if you are doing an audit, and you should be able to say, it should never happen then your data requirements are much more strict than if you would say, what is the biggest opportunity to improve? That can already be done on a sample of your data, right? So that's also one thing to think about. And one of the pitfalls is also that people would stop there, right? So if they kind of define the risk and then they would say, okay, it's not possible. And then the answer to the sponsor, it's not possible. But I think it could be that it is not possible, but you can always kind of advise on the countermeasure. What should you do, right? So in which conditions it is possible, and what can be changed. And if we, for example, implement a new system, what should we do? What kind of requirements do we set?
Or manually collect some data, or also the same thing what you just said with data quality, right? So sometimes maybe data quality isn't perfect, but people sometimes have this all or nothing mindset that if the data quality isn't perfect, they can't do it. But that's usually not the point. You cannot do some things, but you can do other things. So
data, of course, is a risk, and I think the best way is to think about these risks in your project plan and also align with the sponsor, right? So to think about, okay, if these risks become apparent, at which stage in the project phases do we start discussing these risks? And maybe think about also the mitigation of these risks, right? So if you are in the defined phase, and if you would say, okay, let's pull data or let's look for data. Now, if it's there, then we can assess a sample. And if the sample is good enough to continue, then these two checks on the checklist make sure that we can go and move to the next phase before we actually do invest a lot of time to get the full data set, for example. and continue. Yeah.
That's a really good example. So it's like that brings us to the fifth ingredient is basically to think about the deliverables, right? So what are the things that you want to produce and how you structure them to reduce the risks, like we just discussed before. So often in the project plan, so we've just drawn up like a schematic one with kind of a common structure. You recognize this surely from project plans you have seen in your company. So often you have these kind of here as a diamond shape in red, kind of a milestone. They're often there to have a kind of a synchronization point, a communication point to check, for example, and a feasibility study, what Rudi just mentioned, would be an excellent way to counter one of these, this very significant risk in a process-mining project based on a sample of some data that you request very early on to determine whether it's even available or suitable, and have that really early as kind of a point in your project, and also by doing that to manage expectation, right? So from the beginning, when you're making the plan, you can communicate with the people that you don't know yet whether it will be possible to do the process-mining analysis for this process. So you have built in this kind of breaking point in the beginning where you can then have this kind of go or no-go decision. And if you have communicated this clearly from the beginning, then there's not a surprise, and it's not a failure of your project if the data turns out not to be good, right? But people are prepared. Like, what are they getting? So it's really about this communication, right? So,
and the second thing is you make your sponsor involved, right? So if the sponsor would say, okay, but if there's something we can do, and so sometimes we see in government that they have kind of outsourced part of their IT infrastructure, and then they get this challenge to get this data from the external vendor, right? So it takes cycles, and if you directly ask, then of course you're kind of, on the business side, you're far away from the IT side, right? So then it's difficult to find the right way in order to be able to request the data. But often the sponsor has this capability, right? So then if it needs investment or if it needs kind of alignment with the IT manager, then this can be done. So also in the escalation process, it would be better to find the right countermeasures in order to be successful. And at a certain moment in time, if you just can't decide together that maybe you should take another path, or maybe you should pass, or maybe you should give up, so that sometimes also could be a good option, but do it as early on, right? So if you have invested already months or hours or weeks in it, then it's of course much more difficult to let go, instead of trying to evaluate early on and to catch these risks early on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And maybe so here we also see, or we have seen kind of a timeline like of weeks, right? That's also sometimes something that people ask themselves: how much time should I budget for my first project in a project plan? And maybe that brings us back to the different situations that we sketched in the beginning. So what's the goal of the project, right? If it's just a learning project where you want to get your first experience with process mining, if there's a clear kind of process improvement attached to that, so there's going to be a different scope that makes sense for the project, right?
Yeah. So I think there are different scenarios, right? So if you start learning, then I would recommend to keep it as small as possible. So 4-6 weeks or something like that, to have tangible results, and also not promise some big change in the process itself, but kind of promise an insight or expectation of the process, for example. If you look for process improvement, then I think it can be done in 10 weeks, right? So to keep it time boxed, it would be good to have kind of a promise to have tangible results within 10 weeks. However, if it's a process that crosses boundaries of multiple departments, then often you are looking at timelines of 6 months, for example. That is also normal for a Lean Six Sigma initiative. That crosses the different organizational walls.
Yeah, exactly. So that's going to vary depending on your project, but whichever type of project you are doing. So that would be our advice to, not make a super detailed, very big plan, so it cannot, you can easily, let's say, get a little bit lost in the planning and if you're writing a project report of multiple pages, it's maybe not the right thing. It's really, you should use it as a tool with the focus on the risks and the communication points. So that's really like what the project plan really helps you with. And that would be our advice, to think about concretely the deliverables that you're creating in the project, and then make the time planning based on with these risks in mind, and to focus on the communication point with the different people that you're coordinating.
Yeah, and also, of course, allocating the resources which you actually need to be successful, right? So that's also a big part of this. Yeah.
That's the thing, right? That if you have access to the subject matter expert to ask your questions, which is really important from a process mining perspective. So, have a meeting scheduled with them once a week, for example, so that all the questions that came up in that week, you have the chance to get their domain expertise to answer them. Otherwise, you are stuck and you actually can't go further. So, these are this is what the project plan is for you, to make sure you get that time.
So one of the questions in the chat is if we can get these Gantt charts like visuals, I think, which we've shown before as part of the project plan, as part of the process mining exercise, and that's not the case, right? So the process mining tool visualizes the process map itself. The Gantt chart, which we've shown, is more kind of defining your project plan. As you go.
It's true, but it's interesting. Maybe I will see if I can find that as an example somewhere. But there have been examples, or there have been instances where people have analyzed their project process, right? And one ingredient of a project management process is that you have a lot of parallel parts, usually, because there are multiple people involved who are doing different things in parallel. And then you have kind of these milestones as synchronization points. So it's a highly parallel process. And that in itself brings, again, some challenges. So we can point an example where process mining was used in this domain, but it's not, like you're saying, it's not used to produce these type of Gantt charts. It's something that you manually map out as part of your planning process.
Yeah, it also made me think about the example of Mark Tollens from KLM that did the analysis on the agile process itself, right? So also the DMIC process, it depends on which project management system you are actually using, but if it has these phases, then of course you can also apply process mining to it, and then can find things where maybe you have a different approach. And the interesting thing what Mark was doing is look at the different agile teams and then look at their characteristics. So are they taking in more work than they actually can achieve within a sprint? Or are they under-promising, but then waiting for other teams to do it? So then they are able to learn from each other what the effects are of their own behavior. That was also an interesting one.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, let's point to that too. Yeah. Now, one last question that I see in the chat is what to do if the organization is not confident that they can handle the data, or that there are some other showstoppers, right? And I think that's something that you really need to keep in mind and be open about, that it might be ultimately not the right tool, for example, for a particular problem, or that it's not feasible because if the data isn't there. So that's, I think, one of the essential things of making a good project plan is that you can kind of mitigate this risk and define, as early as possible, define how you can find out as early as possible if you need to, that's the case.
Yeah, but I think you can also be a little bit creative, right? So if you're doing this and it depends a little bit on what the culture is within the organization, that also differs from organization to organization. But another way to mitigate that data risk is to get a little bit more time. And so to give yourself a little bit more time to see what works and what doesn't. So if people are from the start very strict in if we do something and if we invest money in it, then we should have this business case kind of resolved. And then you're already kind of in a setting where you should fulfill this particular promise because you are already in this business case. But if you have kind of a feasibility study before, that gives you time to learn a little bit more, to find where the challenges are, then you can also be clear about it. Because if you learn, then you start knowing where there are gaps or things that are impossible, and then you can be clear about it. So there are different ways kind of to mitigate that data risk. So you can say it's not possible, or it's challenging, or we should have more investment, we should have these experts. But on the other hand, you can also say, okay, we are doing small data because I can work with Excel. Let's try that and let's see where things are possible and aren't. But people are not expecting these overpromised results tomorrow, right? Yeah. And that's kind of a different approach, a softer approach, I think, to get there. And it depends a little bit on the culture of the organization, or what can be done, how you get started, right? So there are different ways, but I think it's important also to make the right decision for your organization and for yourself. What would be the best way?
Yeah, but the data recommendations that you just gave, I think that's a very good point, and maybe again another reason maybe to look at the data preparation café as a companion to this, because the data is one of the biggest risks, and it's a lot of questions that people have. What if there is no data? What can you do about it, right? And we talk extensively about that and give some concrete examples. So we will make sure to link that to, especially with respect to this kind of big question, what if the data isn't there?
Yeah, and I think it's good to also to answer the question, is the data risk because of the asset, the data itself, or because of the skills, right? So there could be two things, because it can sometimes also just be difficult to get the data in the right format or get it out, for example. That really requires a specific skill. And I think it's also good to understand from the beginning which of the two it is. And it's not always clear, so that could also take time in order to understand which one of it is, the two it is. Yeah.
That's right. All right, I think we covered most of the points that we wanted to cover. Is there something important that we forgot, you think?
No, I think it's an important step, right, to do the project plan. Don't skip it from the start. So sometimes we see that people directly go into the analysis, right?
It's so tempting.
If they do, they can still have some great results, right? So don't misunderstand me. But I think for the longer term, or if you really want to achieve an objective, you need to think about, how to do it. And this is, I think, one of the important steps is, if you are doing this for the first time, it's kind of making that structure that you can repeat it eventually. And that you can involve more people into the whole process mining initiative, because you can integrate it with your approach. You can have kind of standard steps for it. Maybe you can develop some templates for it or checklist for it. And in this way, you can involve more people as part of the whole process mining initiative. And I think then you can bring more value and scale it up.
Yep. Okay, very good. Great. Thanks everyone for joining us for the session today. We will continue the project guide series. So far we covered step 1 and step 2, the process selection and the project plan. But of course there are many more steps to come and to dive into more details. So you will hear more about that in the coming weeks and months. If you have questions or topics you would like to hear about at Process Mining Camp, you can always contact us via camp@fluxicon.com, as you just saw. And again, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you again in October, right, Rudi, with talking about analysis transformations. So we will be back.
It's going to be an interesting one.
Yeah. All right. See you, everyone. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye.